George is everywhere doing everything all the time.
I'm out here.
He's been instrumental in the development of the Foodie project. One of our biggest champions, I think. Are you working on all of our projects? Nearly so.
Well, he's certainly one of my heroes.
Yes, yes. I'm going to see if I can do this off the top of my head. So he was Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins, and now you're Professor Emeritus, correct? You're a geologist by training, and then you also went to the St. Mary's Seminary, or theological, yeah? Seminary. Hi, here we go, folks. You are...
Good morning.
George is on the Baltimore Presbytery Care for Creation Task Force, and also part of the Chesapeake Covenant, Chesapeake Covenant Community, which you might explain a little more, I'm not sure. He also has been working with us on a project with Knox Presbyterian Church, where he's a member, in East Baltimore, which has been working to bring organic, healthy, fresh produce to the community in East Baltimore. Folks down there don't have a lot of healthy food available to them, so we've been doing that the last year, and it's been going pretty well, I think. So, what am I missing? He's this jack of all trades. It would take me 20 minutes to properly introduce you.
Well, let me just add 2 minutes to that, because
Okay.
it's kind of a weird path that I follow, but it makes sense. I was trained as a geologist, and for 20 years I did that at Hopkins. I taught straight geology, mountain ranges, and where they came from, how they came to be mountains. And I loved it. Absolutely loved it. It gets me outside, it gets me doing experiments in the lab, it gets me time to teach with bright students. But along the way, sort of 20 years into it, after I was dean, actually, it was the deanship that got me started down this crazy path, I began to ask myself, what this all matters? Sure, it's fun, and I enjoy it, but what is there in what I am doing besides the fun that I'm having? Can I in some way begin to work on problems that really matter to other people, like questions of sustainability? And so I started teaching on sustainability. And at first I thought I was approaching it just from a scientific point of view. I thought sustainability was learning how to find more earth resources and how to use them intelligently, wisely, efficiently. But the more I worked on it, the more I thought about it and read about it and taught about it, the more I realized that no, there's much more to it than that, because there simply aren't enough resources to bring everyone in the world up to our level of consumption. So we're going to have to allocate resources, and that's immediately a moral choice. And then there's the question of what voice in that allocation do the resources themselves have, or does Earth have? And all of this began to seem like a theological question to me. So I decided that I was going to do a course on sustainability from the perspective of science and theology. And normally I would have gone over to the religious studies department at Hopkins and found someone to co-teach. I like to co-teach, and that would have been my preferred path. But Hopkins doesn't have a religious studies department, so there was no potential partner. But I still thought that this needed to be done, so that's why I went to St. Mary's and got a degree in theology, and I've been trying to weave the two together ever since. And that's sort of what I want to try to do today. But to sort of set the framework, you may remember, those of you who were here will remember, that at our first meeting now 6 weeks ago, it was supposed to have been before, but weather intervened, Bob Lawrence from the School of Public Health laid out for us a whole series of public health issues that are associated with modern methods of commercial agriculture. And where he was going with that, he was really asking the question of sustainability. And his point was to lift up the question of how do we provide adequate food, healthy food, for an order of 9 billion people. And the population is going to reach that in, 50 years or so, sometime during this century. So that's a problem. It's obviously a tough problem. How do we do that without destroying the planetary life system on which we all depend? How do we make this balance? And how do we figure out how to do that within this half century? Because that's about the time limit within which we need to think and work. And afterward, in the reflection on texts, Chris Layton suggested that religious communities need to help, and that one way they can help in deciding how to do that is by lifting up the root causes of the problem. In effect, as I understood you, you were saying that the church can play an important prophetic role here, lifting up its prophetic voice. But you then used the story of Babel to frame some of the difficulties we face because of differences in language, which now divide us. And obviously the different nations of the world coming together, there are linguistic problems there. But to me, the most interesting ones were the way in which our different disciplines, theology and geology, for example, have different languages and different ways of speaking and often don't communicate very well. And in particular, it struck me that the question of the language of science and the language of religious thought are generally so disparate that there's very little constructive conversation between them. But I'm convinced, first of all, that the religious community has to play a vital role in that conversation about how we feed the world. But I'm convinced that the religious community can't lift up a credible voice unless we find a way of somehow combining the scientific knowledge of how the world works with the wisdom and the moral perspective of our religious traditions. We have to find a way to do that. And for me, the second chapter, those of you who were here last time know that in a general way we sort of structured this around Ellen Davis' book, Scripture, Culture, and Agriculture. And the second chapter, which I sort of refer to as Knowing the Land, offers what I think is a very fruitful way of approaching that problem, bringing the scientific voice together with the religious voice. She notes that there are huge connections between the biblical stories, the biblical literature, and agrarian writing, contemporary agrarian writing by people like Aldo Leopold and Wendell Berry. And this morning, what I want to do is to focus on that idea. And you may remember that, not now, gosh, it's been 4 weeks since you mailed out those 2 papers, that we sent out 2 papers. One, the front cover looks like this, and the other one, the front cover looks like this, that were sort of intended, in my view, to highlight the question of how science gets together with the agrarian perspective. And I want to sort of explore that with you this morning, and then later on we'll have a discussion using a couple of texts from Jeremiah and an excerpt from another example of agrarian writing, in hopes of sort of outlining the bridge that I sense as a possible way of connecting that scientific language with religious language. Now, one of these papers, the one that looks like this, is by David Montgomery. For those of you who haven't had time to read it, it's called Is Agriculture Eroding Civilization's Foundation? And this paper was published in a journal that's put out by the Geological Society of America, the standard professional organizations to which geologists belong. And it's a good example of a scientific paper. It uses the impersonal, the unemotional, the quantitative language of science, and it treats land or soil as an object of study. It stands outside and looks at it and analyzes what's going on. That's the perspective that science normally takes. And of course, the goal is to try to find universal relationships, universal principles that apply anywhere in the world and that apply in some way over all time. And what he did in order to do this was to take a look at erosion rates over the last 10,000 years since the beginning of agriculture, and then to try to compare those erosion rates with erosion rates for the first 500 million years, for the prior 500 million years, before humans and agriculture and so forth came on the scene. And he found there's a big difference. And the conclusion was that, yes, in fact, modern methods of agriculture do lead to rates of erosion, which trash the soil, which eliminate the soil, and thereby is eroding, literally, civilization's foundation. But the paper wasn't a total downer, because along the way, he noticed that we can solve the problem by using no-till methods of farming, where you don't plow the land, you simply press the seeds down into the soil. And it's a more time-consuming way of farming, but it's one in which you don't open the soil up and allow it to be eroded. And by measuring rates of erosion in areas where no-till farming is being practiced, he established that no-till farming is almost the same as no farming at all in terms of its erosion rate. So that if we somehow convert the bulk of our present farming from the plow-based method of farming to a no-till system, we'll probably be okay. We'll be able to retain the soil base. Now, the way in which he makes that point, of course, is by presenting figures that show data and tables that show data. It's a data-centered piece. And for people like me who are comfortable with reading that, it's easy to read. You get the point, and at least I find the case that he makes for that fairly intellectually compelling. But in a sense, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the farmers think. The big question is, how compelling does the farming industry find this argument that they need to abandon their present methods of farming and go over to no-till farming? They've got a huge investment in their present methods of farming. I don't see them putting their hands up and say, yeah, that sounds good to us, let's do it. Let's redo the whole way we do our business. One could think.
Unless it comes with a government subsidy.
Well, that's a government subsidy or some sort of a government policy.
Right.
The trouble is, of course, that the the farming lobby is one of the most effective lobbies in Congress. And so my own sense is that if government does establish a policy which demands that, it's going to come with a very big subsidy, or it's going to come with a huge sweetener. That's going to be a very tricky thing to do. So the question is there some other way in which we might transform our method of agriculture? And the other paper, which is entitled, it's an essay, a chapter, in a volume that was really edited by Wes Jackson of the Land Institute. And the volume is entitled Rooted in the Land, Essays on Community and Place. And David Klein's chapter, which I personally like very much, is just titled An Amish Perspective. He's not from Pennsylvania, he's from the Ohio community of the Amish, but he farms as a member of the Amish community. And this is, I think, a very good example of the kind of agrarian writing that Ellen Davis is focusing on in her chapter in her book. And the interesting thing is that his point, Klein's point, as I read it, is in many ways very similar to Montgomery's point in the GSA paper. Klein is arguing that farming methods that try to maximize production in the short, this week, this year, this quarter, tend to be very dangerous in the long term, which I think they're basically making the same point. But the point I really want to lift up is not that they agree, but that the style and the content of Klein's paper is almost totally different from the style and the content of a typical scientific paper. Let me read you a couple of short excerpts for those who haven't had a chance to read this. Just reading, quoting from Klein. The health of a farm is not brought about by some heroic feat of technology, but rather by thousands of small acts and restraints handed down by generations of experience. He's quoting Wendell Berry at that point. These are the small acts that my family and I often perform as the teams are resting while plowing and planting. Remember, he's Amish, so a team of horses is powering his plow, not a John Deere tractor. Maybe it's only carrying a rock off the field or moving a piece of sod to some low spot to check possible erosion, or moving a killdeer's nest or a horned lark's nest out of harm's way. These small acts of stewardship, multiplied 1,000 times, do add up. A great deal depends on whether we look at the farm as a food factory, where nature suffers at the expense of profit, or we look at the farm as a place to live, where, and here he's quoting Aldo Leopold, where there is a harmonious balance between plants, animals, and people, between domestic and wild, between utility and beauty. So, unlike Montgomery, Klein doesn't see the solution to this problem in terms of some industry-wide change in technology, a heroic feat of technology, as he put it. Instead, he sees the solution in terms of thousands of small acts and restraints performed by individual people. And in farming, these are skills that have been handed down by generations of Amish farmers. He traces it all the way back to the original Amish farms in Germany. And of course, Klein himself learned these skills as a boy, watching his father restore the land of his farm, which had been farmed out, been trashed by some prior owner. And land restoration is incredibly complicated. It involves much more than just intellectual knowledge of facts and principles about how we ought to farm. It takes personal skill. It's not about facts, it's about skill, a completely different kind of knowing. Skill at working the land. Skills at recognizing what's gone wrong. Knowing how to repair the damage. Knowing how to cultivate the land without causing further damage. And those skills aren't learned by reading a tract paper on no-till farming. They're learned by watching, by trying, by failing, sometimes getting it a little bit right, and then after more experience, getting it more and more right. Knowing how to farm takes personal experience with the particular soils and the particular topography of a region. It's not universal, it's not global, it's local. And some of the most important skills are just so subtle that I very much doubt that they can be learned at all unless one begins to care, and care deeply about the well-being of the land. Not just in an intellectual way, but in an inner visceral way. You have to become really attentive to the signs of health or ill health that you see in the soil. And those aren't easy to read. Klein is successful as a farmer because he knows his land so well. He knows what kind of crops work on his soil, what crops work together, what crops don't work together, how they respond to changes in the season, all of that stuff that he's learned from his father who learned it, and so forth, all the way back. And he clearly cares deeply about the land. unlike Montgomery, from whom the land was an object of study, the land is not an object of study for Klein. It's much more like a member of the family. It's a partner in a mutual effort to flourish, to do well. And it has rights. Responsibilities, yeah, produce a crop, but rights, you can't trash it. Consequently, Klein's writing, and agrarian writing in general, doesn't use the objective, measured language of science. Klein writes in a personal, passionate language, in which he tries to express the qualitative difference between his way of farming and the ways of commercial agriculture. He cites absolutely no data. There's not a table of data in his paper. He simply tells stories. And most of those stories are very brief little vignettes, almost like parables. And they all are intended and do convey his personal sense of commitment to the land that feeds his family. And that family relationship to the land is absolutely vital. And there's lots of mystery in all of this. But Klein, unlike a science paper, Klein is very comfortable with that mystery. He simply tries to find ways of working with the land, learning from the land, letting the land speak to him, adjusting his plans to benefit the land as well as himself, that mutuality, but adjusting his plans as he goes along. When we read Montgomery's paper, we get his point about the dangers of erosion, but we get it in an intellectual way that doesn't tend to change the way we live our lives, or that does so only clumsily. That doesn't compel us to change the way we live. But if we allow ourselves to resonate with the parables that we find in Klein's paper, I think we sense something lurking behind the power and the simplicity of his commitment that most of us who live in cities, and those of us who live in the suburbs, those of us who no longer farm the land, no longer work the land daily, have totally forgotten. We've forgotten what it is to care deeply for the land. We've lost the habit of making those thousands of small acts and restraints handed down by generations of experience that are needed to keep land healthy. In Klein's essay, he talks a lot about his ancestors who used to farm the land generations back. And that reminds us that many of our ancestors a century ago, or 2 centuries ago, also farmed the land and felt a deep commitment to their land. And Klein's essay thereby invites us, I think, to feel grateful for the thousands of small acts and restraints that our ancestors exercised. The small acts and restraints that preserve the land so that the land feeds us today. And in that memory, maybe we can feel the quiet nudge of an inner responsibility to allow a similar commitment on our part to shape the way we live our lives in order that our descendants, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, will have healthy land that will feed them and their families too. And perhaps that inner sense of responsibility can begin to shape the way we live and the way we eat. Klein's chapter doesn't persuade us intellectually, doesn't convince us. It invites us to remember our deep relationship, connection with the land, and once again to care for the land. It really offers redemption or conversion, not new facts or principles that we need to learn. And I don't know Klein at all, but the title of his essay obviously indicates that he's Amish. And so there may be more than just the secular agrarian commitment to his thinking, his attitude toward the land. But he wears his religious convictions in the essay so lightly that it's very hard to tell how his sense of connectedness to the land is just that of a farmer and how it is, in some sense, grounded in this religious tradition. But as Davis shows, that agrarian point of view isn't necessarily religious. It informs many passages of people like Aldo Leopold, who I know is not at all religious. And at the same time, even for those non-religious agrarian writers, there are deep connections with our biblical traditions, and that's the point of Ellen Davis's book. And let me turn now to one of my favorite authors, Walter Brueggemann, whose wonderful book, In the Land, published now nearly 30 years ago, reminds us of the central role that land played in so many of the biblical stories that we're familiar with. It's obvious in the expulsion from the garden, for example. Land is a huge issue there. Obviously in Abram's trek to Canaan, it's huge. In the Exodus, that's the point of the Exodus. In the exile, the opposite side of the point of the Exodus. Even Jesus' portrayal of God's kingdom to a first century Jewish audience, his listeners, that would have meant return from the exile. So the question of land is vitally important throughout the Bible, not just the Hebrew Bible. And those stories, taken together, all frame a distinctive biblical perspective on how Jewish people are to live in the land of promise. That's, in a sense, the big take-home topic, I think, of the Bible. And they give depth to the covenantal understanding that's expressed in the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the prophets, and many other texts. We're at least generally familiar, I think, with most of those laws, the laws that tell us to allow the land to lie fallow once every 7 years, the laws that mandate allowing neighbors to glean from our property, and the laws the Jubilee laws that are intended to keep the land in the family. And of course, above all, we honor the first commandment, that we are not to allow other gods, like the gods of fertility, or the gods of profit, or the gods of productivity, to come between us and our God, Yahweh, the God of the Bible. We know those laws, we know those principles intellectually, and we do our best to follow them most of the time. But those laws are abstract principles to us, and we tend to have trouble allowing them to shape those thousands of small acts and restraints that do shape our lives, the ones we make and the ones we don't make. That's the way we shape our lives. And I find that it helps me at least, if we remember that those laws aren't just abstract goals, abstract principles. They weren't graven in stone. They didn't, for the most part. The Big Ten, of course, did come down from on high. But most of those laws didn't come down from on high, graven in stone. They seem to have emerged from the cumulative experience of generations of Israelite farmers as they struggled to farm the very difficult hill country of Judea. And that's no easy task. The soil is thin and very fragile. It's easily eroded. The rain is sparse, and it comes in the winter, the wrong time of the year. And those winter storms can be absolutely ferocious, just stripping the land of the topsoil that means life. The Israelites didn't need a geology professor to tell them that the rate of erosion when you're farming the land exceeds the rate of soil production. They saw it in their little patchy hillside fields. They saw that soil being stripped away every winter. And somehow they realized that the solution to their problem was to prevent that rain from running off, to allow it to soak into the soil, so that it wouldn't erode, but also so that the moisture would still be there in the summer when they were trying to grow the crops. Mm-hmm. And presumably, it's hard to tell this from the Bible, but presumably, it didn't go right the first year. They must have struggled and failed many times, but eventually they got it more or less right. They learned how to terrace the fields so that the hills aren't eroded so quickly. They learned how to put nutrients, use animal waste to put nutrients back into the soil. And probably most important, they learned that thing about allowing the land to lie fallow 1 year in 7. And how totally counterproductive is that for a people that were always living on the edge of hunger? That's an extraordinary thing for them to have responsibility for them to have taken upon themselves. But it's crucial. It's probably the most crucial thing they did, because allowing the land to lie fallow that way keeps the soil loose and friable so that it can absorb those winter rains. They seem to have learned all of that by struggling to save the soil. I'm sure they failed often, but they learned from their failures and their successes alike. And the remarkable thing is that they saw all of that learning as God's word to them. Isaiah 28 puts it beautifully. That hard-won skill at farming was God's wonderful counsel, as Isaiah 28:29 puts it. God's way of teaching them. And I love this little phrase. God's way of teaching them precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little. Gradually, slowly, not in one big burst of insight, but gradually. In the NRSV, the footnotes inform us that the meaning of that last phrase is very difficult to work out, and different translations render it differently. It's not even clear who's speaking, let alone what the words spoken really are. But that very mystery suggests to me, and the context suggests to me, that it's God's way of speaking, God's gentle nudging of the farmers, God's quiet murmuring in the ear of those Israelite farmers, saying, try this, or as Klein put it, move this rock, or put the sod there, or get that bird's nest out of harm's way. That's the way farmers learn. That's the way people learn new things. We sense that planting this piece of sod or leveling that ground might help, and so we try it. And occasionally we get it right, and it works. Probably more often we don't get it, and we learn that that doesn't work. So we do the things that consistently work, and we don't do the things that consistently lead to disaster. And eventually along the way, we learn really how to do things. And so my point is that I think the Israelite farmers learned all of this stuff that's expressed in the agricultural laws by paying very careful attention to the needs of the soil, just as Klein describes himself doing. And they began to see the land not as just dirt that can produce a crop, but as a partner in a mutual effort to flourish. And they discovered that when people, soil, and rain worked together, the land would rejoice by producing the crops that would feed the people. So God was blessing them all, blessing the people, blessing the creatures of the land, blessing the land itself. And in that sense of mutual blessing, the Israelites figured out two things that sort of frame the whole biblical notion of the land, and I think are crucial to our understanding of the way we need to structure our agriculture. One of them is very familiar, the idea of covenant. The idea that God is in committed relationship with both land and people, and that human flourishing depends upon allowing land and the poor of the land to flourish as well by not abusing either the people or the land itself. The other is much less familiar in Christian circles, but it's the idea, it's expressed by the Hebrew word nachala, which is usually translated inheritance or heritage. And the idea is that, yes, God created the land, ultimately. God is the ultimate source of the land that feeds us. But the land that we have today has been handed down to us and preserved for us by our ancestors. It is, in that sense, our inheritance or our heritage. But because we can't recreate land, it's our responsibility to preserve the land, preserve the fertility of the land for coming generations. And in that sense, it's more like the English word legacy, where it's not just stuff that we've gotten, it's something that we need to preserve for the next generation. And that's a huge responsibility. Preservation of the land, nachala, is a sacred trust that is granted to the people, and violation of that sacred trust is one of the major reasons for the exile. So those two together, they're deeply woven together, the idea of covenant and nachala, or that idea of legacy, deeply woven together, but they structure the whole biblical notion of land. And together they sort of sketch out what I refer to as a Sabbath economy, where the land is allowed to have the sabbatical rest. And the interesting thing is that as you look, as you try to discern what this attitude, this biblical perspective on land is, you find it's almost exactly the same thing as we're sensing in the agrarian literature that Davis is inviting us to read. It really is very, very deeply connected with the biblical perspective. And the point, I think, here is that this commitment to Sabbath economy as opposed to production economy is not the result of farmers, of policies that are imposed by some outside agency, either God promulgating laws that structure the way we live, or government promulgating policies that structure the way agriculture is performed. But it emerges from a personal commitment that comes from deep acquaintance with the land and gratitude both to the ultimate giver of the land, God, and to our ancestors who preserved the land for us. And I think that commitment just simply wells up out of that deep sense of caring for the land that Klein expresses, in my view, so beautifully. So it strikes me that the challenge we face, and the way the church can contribute to this, is that we need to find those small acts and restraints that you and I can practice, ways that will help us reconnect with the land that sustains us, ways that can give us that deep sense of connectedness. And so make the health of the land an automatic priority. It shouldn't be something we have to think about. It should be something we do almost instinctively. How do we do that? Especially for those of us who live in cities and suburbs. How do we do that? Well, I'm terribly optimistic about the present tendency to do personal gardening. Urban gardening, I think, is an extraordinary... Angela was talking about the CSA that we're operating at Knox Presbyterian Church. Well, Knox is getting interested in doing urban gardening as well. The community right next door has a communal garden. There's a movement afoot to have people doing not just communal gardening, but backyard gardening, where you just open your kitchen door and go out and get some herbs. And I don't think it matters whether we're growing just a few herbs and tomatoes. Do it. It's a question of getting your hand dirty, getting your hand into the soil and planting and watching what happens as the spring rain and the summer warmth begin to affect those soils. It's that visceral personal connection with the reproductive, the vegetative processes that have dominated this planet for 400 billion years. And the point, I think, though, is that there isn't just one way of doing this. I've just tossed out those two CSAs and small kitchen gardens. But I think the task is for each of us, each of our communities, to reflect on what the opportunities are, for where we happen to live, and find some of those opportunities and turn them into little acts and restraints. And I think we'll all come up with different. We're not going to come up with a uniform plan. We're going to come up with a wide range of approaches. And I think that diversity is exactly what's needed, because we need to find individual things that work for us, individually, personally, that allow us to sense and be part of that connection, that engage us personally and passionately in the way God intends for us to be engaged, so that we can preserve the legacy of the land that feeds us, and that legacy will still be here to support our grandchildren. Thank you so much. And what we will do in a few minutes is to hand out some texts. One of these is from a thing called The Worst Hard Time, which is a book on the Dust Bowl era. And the other one is from my other favorite book. This is the Earth Bible, by the way. This is a Bible. Instead of the red letter version, this is the green letter version. Everything in the Bible that relates to land is all those lines are highlighted in green. And I particularly like the material in Jeremiah. That's probably not the most familiar of prophets to people in the Christian community. We all tend to go to Isaiah, and Isaiah is beautiful, but if you're interested in the land, Jeremiah is your guy. Right at the very beginning, Jeremiah's call reads this way: "See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up," or as the Jewish Publication Society translation has it, to uproot. To uproot and to pull down plants, to destroy and to overthrow, and then to build and to plant. And all the way through Jeremiah, the texts about redemption of the people and restoration of the land are so deeply intertwined, you can't tell what he's talking about. Is this metaphor or is this not metaphor? And the descriptions of the land, of the restoration of the damage that's been to the land, are so ecologically right on that I think he clearly knew what land that had been over-farmed looked like. And I have the very strong impression that Israel at that point had been severely over-farmed. And of course, he refers to the whole exile not just as a political defeat, but as a sabbatical, a time out, a time for redemption of the people and restoration of the land. So I'm going to offer you a couple of short passages from Jeremiah, and then we will together, first at table and then sort of as a plenary group, reflect on how those connect.